We are on lesson what I think is 9. We're looking at two characters, both from the book of Acts, who have, to one extent or another, the same name, and that name is Agrippa. One of them is called in the New Testament Agrippa. The other one is not called Agrippa, he's just called Herod. They were both one of the Herods, but one of them is not called Herod, he's called Agrippa. But who they were actually in history is Agrippa the First and Agrippa the Second. Agrippa the First comes from Acts chapter 12, and a very serious thing happened in his life. That's the only thing is recorded about him, and then that's it, although there is something to learn from that. The other Agrippa is more prominent in our usual Bible considerations from Acts 25 and 26 because he came in direct contact with Paul, and we'll see more about that. The word Agrippa, the name Agrippa, talk about variations of meaning. How's this for a variation? The name means either, it could be neither of these, by the way, but as far as things that have been suggested, one who at his birth causes pain, which is pretty vague, I would say. I think everybody's Agrippa, but the other possibility is wild horse tamer. So, who knows? Those are quite a bit different. So, obviously, it's not exactly certain what that name means. But like I said, Agrippa the First is exclusively called Herod in the New Testament. He's one of the Herods of the New Testament record. Agrippa the Second, however, is the only Agrippa of the New Testament. He's not literally, but the only one called that. So if you looked up the word Agrippa in a Bible app or in a concordance, all of the references are going to be about Agrippa the Second because Agrippa the First is never called Agrippa in the book of Acts. So what can we say about Agrippa the First? Well, he was born in 10 BC, around 10 BC. He died around AD 44, and he reigned from about 37 to 44. That puts his reign right after Jesus' death, or not right after, but sometime within a decade of Jesus' death. And his reign ended when his life ended, it seems. He was the son of Bernice and Aristobulus, who happened to be two first cousins, by the way. He was the grandson of Herod the Great. And we all know a little bit about Herod the Great. He was the Herod of baby Jesus fame, not for good reasons. He was raised and educated at Rome. And by the way, whenever your granddad is Herod the Great, it's not good for you, at least for your reputation, because Herod the Great was an absolute psychopath. And we don't get the impression that maybe his grandson was quite as bad as he was, but it was just not a great family. It's not somebody, the family reunions would not be anything you want any part of, I'm sure. But unlike his granddad, he was generally, at least his reputation was, he was gracious and kind. He had an eloquence about him, which is going to play a role in what we read about him. But he was also quite vain. He was a little maybe too obsessed with public perception of him, popularity. And because of that, he had a lot of magnetism, which is pretty convenient for somebody in his position. He was zealous as a Jew, it seems, as far as that goes. And he was one of those that Jesus kind of talked about being really focusing on the tithing and things like that, but not so much about justice and mercy and faithfulness. But who was he? Well, there's his jurisdiction. Pretty much the whole Bible land area, what we would call the Bible lands. It was where he was headquartered, I guess, in a way. We're going to call him the man who wasn't a god after all. And that might remind you of what we read about him. It's in Acts chapter 12, verses 20 through 23. It says, "Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him with one accord. And having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace, because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, 'The voice of a God, and not of a man.' Immediately, an angel of the Lord struck him down, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last." And that is the end of Agrippa I in the narrative of Scripture and on the earth. So that's it. This is the Herod that is referred to here. It's not the only place he's referenced. He's referenced throughout the chapter. But at any rate, he was we already talked about he had an eloquence about him. He was magnetic. Well, he put on this royal robes, as Luke puts it. He delivers this speech at probably an amphitheater, similar to this, maybe, something like that, or similar to that. And people started calling him a god. This isn't a man, this is a god. Now, I don't know if they seriously thought that, or if they were just sucking up to the Herod, Either way, they were saying it. And Agrippa, being the kind of man that he was, he kind of liked that. That sounded kind of good, God, whew. I can get used to this. Except he didn't get used to that, because at that very moment, the Lord afflicted him with something. Here's how Luke puts it very simply. He was eaten by worms. Even that short version doesn't sound great. But Josephus, who was born around the time that Herod Agrippa started reigning as the Herod, he was a little bit more detailed. Okay. I don't think I have this quote in the outline, so I'll have to turn this way to read it. Here's the long version, okay? "Now when Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city Caesarea, which was formerly called Strato's Tower, and there he exhibited shows in honor of Caesar, upon his being informed that there was a certain festival celebrated to make vows for his safety, at which festival a great multitude was gotten together of the principal persons, and such as were of dignity through his province. On the second day of which shows, he put on a garment made wholly of silver and of a contexture truly wonderful, and came into the theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner, and was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him." Now, see, this is the same thing Luke recorded, except a lot more detailed. Not that it's better than Luke's, because I don't think it is, and it's pretty wordy, but still, it's interesting, whereas Luke simply says he put on his royal robes, Josephus, which, take it or leave it, or take it with a grain of salt, or, however people put it, it certainly doesn't disagree with Luke, but it does shed more light, no pun intended in this case, and it says that it was such a time of mourning, and he put on this garment of silver so that the sun, kind of reflected off of it and maybe had this shine about it that contributed to people saying this. Well, it says, "Presently his flatterers cried out, one from one place and another from another, though not for his good, as we'll see, that he was a god. And they added, Be thou merciful to us, and for although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, yet shall we henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature." So sorry, Herod, we thought you were a man before, but never again. We'll treat you like a god from now on. Upon this, the king did neither rebuke them nor reject their impious flattery. But as he afterward looked up, he saw an owl sitting on a certain rope over his head, and immediately understood that this bird was the messenger of ill tidings. That's the kind of part that, did God send this owl to show ill tidings? I don't know of anywhere in Scripture that says that's something God was, if he wanted ill tidings, I'll send an owl over there and they'll get it. No, but he took it that way anyway. He took it as a messenger of ill tidings, as it had once been the messenger of good tidings to him. He fell into the deepest sorrow, a severe pain. Here's where it gets really interesting, for lack of a better word. A severe pain also arose in his belly, and began in a most violent manner. He therefore looked upon his friends and said, I, whom you call a god, am commanded presently to depart this life, while providence thus reproves the lying words you just now said to me, and I, who was by you called immortal, am immediately to be hurried away by death. But I am bound to accept what providence allots, as it pleases God, for we have by no means lived ill, but in a splendid and happy manner. When he said this, his pain was become violent. Accordingly, he was carried into the palace, and the rumor that went abroad everywhere, that he would certainly die in a little time. And the multitude presently sat in sackcloth with their wives and children after the law of their country, and besought God for the king's recovery. Now the king rested in a high chamber, and as he saw them below lying prostrate on the ground, he could not himself forbear weeping. And when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life, being in the 54th year of his age and in the 7th year of his reign. Now, the details of that, some people accuse Josephus of embellishing details and stuff. Maybe some of those were, but when we put it together with Luke's account, we learn a couple of things, if his account is to be trusted at all, is that he didn't die immediately. God didn't, you see, you just take Luke's account, it sounds kind of like he struck him dead right there. It doesn't necessarily say that, though. When we go back and look at Luke, it says immediately he struck him in the sense of what he struck him with was immediate. But the fact that he breathed his last, according to Josephus, didn't happen for another 5 days. So God providentially struck him with an illness immediately, right then. It didn't kill him until 5 days later. But it's a very gruesome thought that whatever this affliction was, it took 5 days to kill him. He was in agony for 5 days. So, that's the end of Agrippa the First. Not much more to say, except for the lessons that we can learn from him, which we will save until the end in a few minutes. All right, what about Agrippa the Second? Well, Agrippa the Second was the man who was a heedless hearer. Paul, at the time when he had said, I want to talk to Caesar personally, directly, which he had every right to do as a Roman citizen, he was under the care of a man named Festus at Caesarea Philippi. And while he was there, we're told in Acts 25, verse 22, that King Agrippa asked to hear Paul himself. So Paul gave his defense again in chapter 26. And upon hearing that, Festus sort of butted in and said, Paul, you're studying so much that it's driven you crazy. You've gone crazy with too much learning. But Paul brushed it aside and addressed Agrippa directly. He looked right at Agrippa and he said a few things. Well, getting ahead of myself here, or the slides. See, Festus wasn't strictly, I guess, a Jew the way, at least like even Herod was. So Festus made fun of Paul. Didn't really take anything about what he said. But it seems that Paul noticed something in in Agrippa that was different than Festus. So he turned to Agrippa, and he said, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? And he said, I know you do. Do you believe the prophets? I know you believe the prophets. And Agrippa said to Paul, and here's his infamous quote. This is his legacy, which is apparently a very difficult statement to translate because the translations vary quite a bit. But he says, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? This is the part that we are so familiar with. You look at, I don't know if there's a single mainstream translation that is totally in agreement, with the possible exception of Old King James and New King James, because every single translation is different. Some of them put it in a question form, like a rhetorical question, like the ESV does. Others put it as a statement. The New King James says, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. The Old American Standard says, but with but little persuasion, thou wouldest fain make me a Christian. The New American Standard says, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. And the ESV, like is on the screen, says, in a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian? And almost all of those could have a totally different meaning. Is he saying, go a little bit longer, Paul, and I'll be a Christian? Or is he saying, is it more condescending, like, you think you're going to make me a Christian that quick? You know, you're going to make me a Christian, hey? Whenever we consider the fact that Festus had just openly made fun of Paul, sort of, and said, boy, this guy, you're out of your mind, Paul, you've been driven mad. It seems to me that Agrippa is probably doing a similar thing here, or at least kind of brushing it aside. You know, you think you're going to make me a Christian that quick in such a short time? So whether he meant with little persuasion or in a short time, it's just, I guess, take your pick which translation makes more sense to you. At the end, the result was the same. He was not converted to Christ. He, even though Paul said, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day, I want everybody to become a Christian, you know, to be a Christian. Or to become just like I am, except for these chains, of course. And the king arose. They said, this man is doing nothing deserving of death. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. We could have let this guy go. So at least he's fair enough to say this man hadn't done anything worthy of death. But he was not convinced. He heard Paul, but then that was it. It didn't go any farther. In a little time, you would make me a Christian. And we don't know what happened to him after that. Maybe he didn't think it seems that he probably didn't take another thought, because it was easy to not think of it anymore. And he had a little bit of maybe unintentional help to not believe by somebody making fun of Paul before, while he was speaking. There's probably a lesson in that alone. But there are some lessons that we can take. Here's one, a simple one. Maybe not be very practical because we might not ever be in this position, but it's probably the only lesson we can take from Agrippa the First. If somebody calls you a god, immediately rebuke them and reject it. Okay? Now, I've never been in that position, and I don't foresee that I ever will be. But if it ever happens, that's what I'm going to do, because I don't want to be eaten by worms, at least not until I'm dead. Then they can do with me whatever they want. But I don't want to suffer what he suffered. And there are other instances in the New Testament where men were put in this situation. Paul and Barnabas were put in this situation and put in that position. And they had to say, stop, no, you got it all wrong. We're men like you. We are not gods in any sense of shape or form, whatever. We are just men, and we serve God. The angel that in the vision that was helping John in the Revelation and there with him in that vision, he said he fell down to worship him. And the angel said, you must not do that. I'm a fellow servant with you. You worship God and God alone. So we see wise people who were mere men or even an angel say, no, you worship God. You get up and you're going to get me in trouble. You worship God alone. And then we see a man that wasn't so wise who didn't do that, and God struck him down as a result. Which, by the way, is another indication that Jesus was not a mere man, because people did this to him and he did not rebuke them, and yet he did not get struck down by God because he was telling the truth. And by allowing that worship, he was claiming that he was God and he was telling the truth. So, Agrippa number 2, or the second, number 2 application, we must use common sense and rational faculties in reception of the gospel. We have to use common sense and our rational abilities that God has given us. That's one of the blessings that God gave man, that we have rationale and we have logic and objective reasoning. We're able to reason through things, whereas animals work off instinct. We don't know exactly how they do what we would call thinking. You know, what we consider thinking. We get the idea, or it seems pretty clear, the animal world doesn't think the way people do, but they somehow know what to do and what not to do. Whereas we as human beings, we have the ability to beforehand, before we're ever in a situation where we have to react on instinct, can measure things out and think and reason. We have to do that even with the gospel. We have to use our reasoning. That's what Paul was trying to incite, for lack of a better word, in Agrippa. He did appeal to him, and he appealed to him directly. Do you believe the prophets? I know you believe the prophets, so why don't you believe in Jesus? You know, if you believe the prophets, and I'll show you what the prophets have said, why don't you believe? But he cut it off. Number 3, one of the biggest stumbling blocks to accepting the truth is the self. In so many instances, in the Scriptures and in real life, we've probably seen, maybe in our own lives even, that the person in the mirror is often the biggest stumbling block. I am keeping myself from accepting, whether I'm keeping myself from accepting the truth initially, or maybe I'm a Christian and I'm keeping myself from accepting this truth, this certain truth, you know, whatever it might be. I am often the biggest stumbling block. It seems that Agrippa, that was the case with Agrippa, maybe both Agrippas in a sense, but especially Agrippa II, he was his own biggest stumbling block. He had a little help from Festus and maybe Bernice, but self. Don't ever overestimate, or underestimate rather, how much you might be preventing yourself from seeing the truth of something and accepting it. And number 4, it's easy to forget about the truth we've heard once we're out of its presence. How true is that? Sometimes in a good way, maybe not the truth we've heard, but something we've heard, something we've seen, something we've experienced, as soon as we're out of its presence, or maybe sometimes a new day is started and that helps forget about something. Well, sometimes, all the time, it's very easy to forget as soon as we leave, like here, for instance. Or for Agrippa II, he was sitting before Paul. Paul made this defense and this case for Christ. And apparently Paul saw something in him that was stirring. Maybe he saw sometimes you can look at somebody and you can see the gears are churning. Something's going on in there. And so he appealed to him directly. Even though Festus made fun of him, he appealed to him and said, do you believe in the prophets? But as soon as Paul left, it's like he snapped out of it. He's like, well, this guy hadn't done anything deserving of death for sure, and if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we could set him free right now. But not a word of anything Paul had said. So as soon as Paul was gone, Agrippa was able to just proceed with his life like he always had. And that is so true for us sometimes. Whenever we're here in this building, it might put us in a certain frame of mind, a certain mood. It's just, this is usually, of course we do other things here sometimes, but usually we come here within these walls to worship together. So when we come here, that's our mind's in that state. But when we leave, it may be gone, instant. It's over. I'm not thinking about it anymore. And that's not to say I've committed a sin if I think about something else when I leave, but is that the last time I'm going to think about it at all until next Sunday? Or will I return to it mentally and keep thinking about it? Agrippa the second is one of the sad examples of out of sight, out of mind. Just like another with the more convenient season, Go on and I'll call you back at a more convenient season. Never happened. Because as far as he was concerned, apparently he was over it. He stopped thinking about it. So Agrippa II shows us it's easy to forget once we leave. So we must strive to always be in its presence. So that way we won't forget.